Well, as we come to the end of this week, I want to finish by taking a look at verses 13 and 14 of chapter 3 in First Peter. But before I do that, I want to really kind of step back again and remind us what is the overall message that Peter is trying to communicate in this letter. At the time, Peter himself was going through hardships, persecutions, if you will. Much of the church was suffering because of their decisions to follow Christ. Because in most cities around the ancient world, and in many villages, if you decided to leave the established religious system, it was viewed as being an existential threat to the entire community, the city, even a nation, because you were no longer worshiping the gods that they looked to for protection. And so when people made a decision to become followers of Christ, if they were an insignificant person, a slave or something like that, they might be able to get away with it as long as it didn't affect them too dramatically. But for people who were citizens or had some kind of status, it could be very damaging. And as more and more people began to embrace the gospel, we find that the persecution began to ramp up. In the very beginning, we know that persecution came from the Jews against other Jews who were coming to Christ, as Paul and Peter and others would go to the synagogues and share the gospel. So we know the first Christians to get saved were actually Jews in the various synagogues around the Mediterranean world. And that caused a lot of irritation and anger and resentment on the part of the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem on out to every place else. And they were doing everything they could do to shut Christianity down from its impact upon Judaism. But we also know, and reading the book of Acts, it was only a matter of time before the Jews themselves began to evangelize the non-Jewish communities. The Gentiles began to come to Christ. There were many Gentiles who would attend the synagogues because they liked the moral teachings and the idea of being only one God who is just and reliable, and not like the pantheon of gods that were as immoral as the people that were called to serve them. And so as a consequence, as these Gentiles began to get saved, especially amongst the slave class, the churches began to grow and become kind of a mixture of Jews and Gentiles, free men and slave men. And even beyond that, we find that many slaves, as they became Christians, had an impact upon their owners. People like Philemon, who gave his life to Christ, very possibly through the influence of his own slaves. And as a consequence, these people began to make a dent really in the culture, and they began to be viewed politically as being an existential threat to the community and the nation. So Peter understood this dynamic, and he was living right in the middle of it. For us living in America and experiencing the kind of liberties and freedoms and the high degree of protection that we have from forces that resent and hate us, it may be a little hard to imagine what it would like to be treated so unjustly. And yet what we find is that this was kind of part of the everyday life of many Christians. And as a consequence, Peter was concerned that people would become so overwhelmed by the adversity and the hardships that they might turn away from the faith. And so the whole letter is written, designed with this idea of how do you fortify yourself spiritually, mentally, emotionally, against the idea of having to face persecution and to suffer as a consequence of your faith. And that's where in verse 13, Peter makes an interesting statement that is basically generally true, but not absolutely true. What do I mean by that? Well, he says, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? In other words, generally speaking, in any society or group of people, you're going to find that if you're doing good, people are going to see you as a positive attribute to the community or in the family or whatever the context is. And so this makes sense. This is generally true, but it's not always true. That many times people suffer for doing the right thing, for saying what's true, not going along with the status quo. Those who point out illegal things that are illegal or unjust are oftentimes vilified by people who have come to a place where immoral and illegal behavior is no longer viewed as such. I mean, I think about today where we look at the growth of the pornographic industry and the sexual slavery and the LGBTQ and the abortion industry and all these things that we look at going on in our own country and in many ways around the world, but predominantly here in the United States. One of the things we see is that there are many people who are saying those things aren't wrong. And even with the church, we find people saying, well, it's no big deal if a couple sleeps together before they're married. That's no big deal, even though the Bible very clearly says it's wrong and it's sin. And the same way that you see same-sex couples in many churches now, they're saying, well, if two people love each other, I don't see why they should be prohibited from being able to marry and carry on that kind of immoral relationship. In fact, there are a couple of denominations, particularly the Presbyterian Church of the United States, has just basically codified it into their book of order that if a gentleman wants to be a pastor in their denomination and will not accept LGBTQ people in their church as being upright standing members, in other words, completely approval of all of these lifestyle choices, they can't be ordained in their denomination. So not only now have they gone to saying it's okay, they'll kick out anybody who says it isn't okay. And so this is a kind of crazy thing where you find as a culture begins to decay, that many times the things that would generally have been accepted for most of our history up until very recently as being good things are now looked upon as evil. And so that's really where it becomes problematic, because if you basically say, I'm suffering and therefore I must have done something wrong, not if you've chosen to walk in the path of goodness. Jesus put it very simply, they hated me and they're going to hate you. They're going to persecute you, Jesus said, because of me. And so we have to understand that this isn't basically a kind of blanket statement that says if you're going through hardships, you've done something wrong. That was the theology of many of the Jews. When Jesus healed a blind man at the pool of Bethesda, that was the response of the religious leaders of the time. Even his own disciples said, was this man born blind because of his sin or because of his mother's sin? And Jesus said, neither. Had nothing to do with his mother or him. He's born blind. So you just realize, but there was a theology of that time that if you had some kind of incapacity, some health problems, poverty, hardships, difficulties, it was because you had offended God and God was punishing you. And if you were rich, wealthy, famous, and otherwise, then that was because you were good and God has rewarded you for being such a good person. That was the theology of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But here we find that Peter takes us a step further. He says, generally speaking, if you do good, you won't suffer as a consequence. But, and there's a big but, even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats and do not be frightened. So here again, Peter's saying, you're going to find that sometimes you're going to do the right thing and you're going to suffer as a consequence. I think of so many examples we even beginning to see in our own state. Here in the state of Washington, our Attorney General, who's now running for governor, has on frequent occasions gone after Christian organizations because of their stand against abortion and same-sex marriage and LGBTQ and the rest. And I mean, there was one lady who owned a flower shop in Southern Washington, who spent 10 years fighting in the courts because of our Attorney General, because she wouldn't make a flower decorations for a same-sex marriage. She'll do it for anybody else, other people who will do it, but this violates my conscience to do this thing, even though these people have been clients with her for years. And the same happens with Jack Phillips with his baking shop in Colorado. And it just goes on and on. We find it with web makers and so forth who are being persecuted because they call same-sex LGBTQ behavior sin and refuse to do it as an act of conscience. They're not speaking out against those people. They're not trying to persecute those people. They're not disparaging those people. They're just simply saying, I won't do what you want me to do because it violates my conscience. Well, so far, the courts have repeatedly supported these people, but guys like Jack Phillips, the state of Colorado, just comes up with new charges over and over again, keeping them in court. Barronelle Stutzman down in Southern Washington ended up spending over $1 million in legal fees, and finally she just settled after 10 years. And this woman she's an elderly woman now, but they just, beat her to death basically by their litigation, by their lawfare. And so we have to understand that these things, when they happen, he said, when you suffer right, do you recognize it's a blessing? Because in a very real sense, Barronella and Jack Phillips, these people are a blessing to people like me. They encourage me by their courage and their strength, and they make me want to stand up, and they make me want to speak up, and make me want to endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Because even though they try to create fear, he said, don't be afraid because of their threats. Don't be frightened into silence and into compliance and into capitulation and accommodation. That's what they're after. And he says, when we stand fast and say, here I stand, I can do nothing else, as Martin Luther said before the Diet of Worms, when he was commanded to stop teaching that the Bible was the ultimate authority and not cardinals and popes. And so this is something that the church has always had to deal with. And we have to understand that we're not exempt from that. And so as we see these things being ratcheted up, they're only going to get worse if we comply. And if we fight against it, we may still lose. But in the end, God is glorified and other people see it and come to a decision of faith in Christ because they see your steadfastness. Well, it's been a big week. I hope it's been good for you. Thank you for following. And I'll check in with you next Monday. Go in His grace.